I'm going to be very clear before I start, and I'm not going to soften this. What follows is not mysticism, not spirituality, and not speculation. It's a line of reasoning that becomes uncomfortable the moment you take physics seriously and stop protecting your intuitions. Now listen carefully. You are absolutely certain your mind is inside your brain. You've never questioned it. Everyone around you assumes it. And yet, the deeper we look, the less that belief survives contact with reality. The shock isn't that we don't fully understand the mind. The shock is that the question itself may be wrong. Let's begin. 1. The biggest mistake is assuming location. Let's slow this down, because this is where almost everyone goes wrong without realizing it. When someone asks, "Where is the mind?" they feel like they're asking a serious scientific question. It sounds reasonable. It sounds intelligent. But the moment that question is asked, a mistake has already been made, a very deep one. The word where belongs to physics. It belongs to space. It belongs to objects that occupy coordinates. You ask where a chair is, where a planet is, where a neuron is. Those questions work because chairs, planets, and neurons are things that exist in space. They have boundaries. They have dimensions. They can be measured, weighed, scanned, and pointed at. Now pause and ask yourself something uncomfortable. When you feel sadness, where exactly is it? Not poetically, not metaphorically, literally. Is it 3 centimeters behind your eyes? Is it sitting in a fold of the cortex? Is it shaped like a thing? Does it have an edge you can trace with an instrument? You immediately feel the problem. The question stops making sense the moment you take it seriously. Thoughts do not sit anywhere. Memories do not occupy volume. Pain does not have a shape you can outline. You experience them, yes. They are real, yes. But they do not behave like objects in space. And physics does not allow us to pretend otherwise. This is the first crack in the story most people were taught. We are trained from childhood to merge experience with the body. You hit your head, you feel dizzy, so you conclude the mind must live there. You see brain scans light up, and you assume those lights are thoughts themselves. But what you are actually seeing is activity, electrical signals, chemical exchanges, motion, not experience. This is where language quietly betrays us. We say, the brain produces thoughts. But produce is a word borrowed from factories and machines. We say, memories are stored in the brain, but stored is a word borrowed from warehouses and hard drives. These metaphors feel scientific, but they are doing all the work while pretending to be explanations. In physics, metaphors are dangerous. They create the illusion of understanding without delivering any. If something has a location, it must be detectable as a thing in space. That's not philosophy. That's a requirement. We can detect fields, we can detect particles, we can detect energy distributions. Even invisible things, like electromagnetic waves, still have measurable properties. They show up when you look the right way. The mind does not. You can scan a brain until you're exhausted. You can map every neuron. You can track every electrical impulse. And nowhere in that map will you find a thought labeled fear, or a memory labeled childhood, or an experience labeled self. You will find correlations. When this region activates, the person reports fear. When that region activates, the person reports memory recall. But correlation is not identity. The brain activity is not the experience. It merely lines up with it. And this distinction is not academic, it's foundational. If you confuse correlation with location, you end up believing the mind is in the brain the same way blood is in veins. But blood can be removed, weighed, transfused. The mind cannot. You cannot extract a thought and place it on a table. You cannot isolate awareness and observe it from the outside. The moment you try, it disappears as an object and remains only as experience. That tells you something important. Physics has rules about what exists where. If the mind truly had a location in the brain, it would be possible, at least in principle, to point to it the way we point to anything else physical. The fact that we can't is not because our tools aren't advanced enough. It's because the mind does not present itself as the kind of thing tools are designed to detect. This is what is meant by a category error. A category error happens when you ask the right question in the wrong category. It's like asking what color a number is or how much a melody weighs. The question sounds grammatical, but it's nonsense once you examine it closely. Asking where the mind is may be the same kind of mistake. The mind does not behave like a thing with boundaries. It behaves like a process, a relationship, an activity. And processes do not have locations in the way objects do. They happen, they unfold, they depend on conditions. But they are not stored somewhere like furniture in a room. Think about a whirlpool. Where is it? You can point to the water molecules, but the whirlpool itself is not a molecule. It is a pattern formed by motion. Remove the conditions, and the whirlpool vanishes without leaving behind a piece you can collect. The mind looks much more like that than like an object. When people insist the mind must be in the brain, what they are really saying is that they are uncomfortable with anything that cannot be pinned down spatially. We trust what we can locate, we distrust what we can't. So we force the mind into a location even if the evidence doesn't support it. But physics doesn't care about comfort. If something refuses to show up as a spatial object, physics does not magically declare it one anyway. Physics waits. Or, if it's being honest, it admits ignorance. And this is where the disturbance begins. Because once you let go of the assumption that the mind must exist somewhere, you are forced to confront a much harder question. Not where the mind is, but what kind of thing it is, if it is a thing at all. That question is far more unsettling. It removes the safety net of simple answers. It prevents you from hiding behind brain scans and diagrams. It forces you to admit that the most familiar part of your existence does not fit neatly into the physical categories you rely on to understand everything else. And that is not a failure of science. That is science doing its job. 2, correlation is not cause, and we keep pretending it is. This is where people think they already won the argument, and it's exactly where the argument actually begins. You've heard this line before. Damage the brain, and the mind changes. Injure certain areas, and memory fades. Alter chemistry, and mood shifts. Shut down regions, and consciousness fragments. From this, people leap to a conclusion that feels obvious. The brain causes the mind. But obvious is not the same as correct. What we are observing, without exception, is correlation. When the brain changes, experience changes alongside it. That much is undeniable. But correlation is not cause, and physics is ruthless about that distinction. If you confuse the two, you end up explaining nothing while believing you've explained everything. Let me make this painfully clear. If you smash a piano, the music stops sounding right. That does not mean the piano creates music as a fundamental entity. It means the piano is necessary for music to be expressed in that form. Damage the instrument, and the performance collapses. No mystery there. The mistake happens when you confuse the instrument with the source. In science, this error has a name, and it shows up everywhere. We observe two things moving together and assume one generates the other because it feels intuitive. But intuition is not a law of nature. It's a habit of thought, and habits can be wrong. When brain activity changes and consciousness changes with it, all you have established is dependence, not identity. Dependence does not tell you what something is. It only tells you what it requires. Your eyesight depends on your eyes. That does not mean the world exists inside your eyes. Damage the lens, and the image distorts. Remove the retina, and vision disappears. But no serious person concludes that mountains live inside eyeballs. Yet when it comes to the mind, we abandon this discipline entirely. We see brain scans lighting up and say, there it is, that's the thought. But what you are seeing is electrical activity, voltage changes, chemical gradients, motion, and nowhere in that description does experience appear. This is not a technical limitation, it is a conceptual one. There is no known physical process that explains how objective activity turns into subjective experience. Not because we haven't found it yet, but because no candidate even points in the right direction. Neurons fire, chemicals bind, signals propagate. At no step does awareness suddenly appear, the way heat appears from motion or pressure appears from force. Heat makes sense, pressure makes sense. They are collective behaviors of matter that remain physical through and through. Consciousness does not behave that way. It does not scale like temperature. It does not add up like mass. 10 unconscious neurons do not become one conscious thought when arranged correctly. And this is where people invoke emergence as if it's an answer. Consciousness emerges from complexity, they say. That sentence sounds scientific, but it is doing no explanatory work at all. It is a placeholder for ignorance. Emergence tells you that something happens when conditions are right, not why it happens or how it happens. Physics does not accept emergence without mechanism. If you propose emergence, you must show the bridge. You must show the step-by-step process by which non-experience becomes experience. And no one has done that, not once. So we are left with a strange situation. The brain is clearly involved. Without it, the mind we know cannot function. Change the brain and experience changes. But involvement is not authorship. Dependence is not creation. Every time we say, the brain produces the mind, we are smuggling in an assumption that has never been justified. We are assuming that because the brain comes first in our diagrams, it must come first in reality. But diagrams are not explanations. They are stories we tell ourselves to stay oriented. What actually happens in experiments is much less dramatic and much more honest. A subject reports an experience. A scanner detects activity. The two are aligned. That's it. The leap from alignment to causation happens in the scientist's head, not in the data. And here's the uncomfortable part. If you strip away the assumption that the brain causes the mind, you are forced to admit something unsettling. We do not know the direction of explanation. We do not know whether the brain generates experience, filters it, shapes it, constrains it, or merely correlates with it as part of a deeper process we don't yet understand. Science prefers simple stories, and the brain creates the mind is a very simple story. It allows us to keep everything physical, measurable, and tidy. But physics has never guaranteed comfort. It only guarantees consistency with evidence. And the evidence does not say what people think it says. All it says is this: there is a tight relationship between brain states and conscious states. That relationship does not tell you what consciousness is, where it comes from, or why it exists at all. Pretending otherwise is not scientific confidence, it is philosophical impatience. The real scientific position here is not triumph, it is humility. And humility is deeply uncomfortable when the subject is the mind itself. Because once you admit correlation is not cause, the easy answers disappear, and you are left staring at a question that refuses to shrink. What exactly is the mind if the brain is not its straightforward source? That question doesn't weaken science. It exposes where science still hasn't caught up with what it's trying to explain. 3, physics never found a place for experience. This is where the discomfort deepens, because now we are no longer talking about brains or psychology. We are talking about physics itself, the most successful framework humanity has ever built for describing reality. And here is the problem no one likes to say out loud. Physics never found experience. Not once. Not even close. As physics advanced, we kept peeling reality down to simpler and simpler components. First, solids became molecules. Molecules became atoms. Atoms became particles. Particles became fields, probabilities, interactions. With each step, the universe became more abstract, more mathematical, more precise. But something strange happened along the way. Everything physical became describable without reference to experience at all. Mass, charge, spin, momentum, wavelength, probability, amplitudes. These are not feelings. They do not feel like anything. They describe how things behave, not what it is like to be anything. Physics is incredibly good at predicting outcomes. It can tell you how particles will scatter, how stars will burn, how atoms will bond. But nowhere in its equations is there a variable for redness, or pain, or joy, or fear, or the feeling of being you. This is not a missing chapter in a textbook. It is a structural absence. You can search every equation we have, classical mechanics, electromagnetism, relativity, quantum theory, and you will not find a symbol that stands for experience itself. Not because physicists forgot to include it, but because physics was never built to describe it. Physics describes the world from the outside. Experience happens from the inside. And those two perspectives do not line up the way we assumed they would. People often respond to this by saying, of course physics doesn't talk about experience. That's because experience is produced by the brain. But that answer quietly assumes what it is supposed to explain. If experience is produced by physical processes, then in principle it should be possible to describe how, not metaphorically, not poetically, mechanistically, step by step. In the same way, physics explains heat as molecular motion or pressure as force per area. But there is no such explanation. We know how neurons fire. We know how signals propagate. We know how networks synchronize. But none of that tells you why any of it should feel like something from the inside. You can describe the entire physical process without ever invoking awareness, and nothing in the description demands that awareness appear. That is the core of the problem. If experience were just another physical property, it would show up in the theory the way other properties do. But it doesn't, and adding more detail does not help. Mapping more neurons does not suddenly cause experience to pop into existence on the page. This is why some people try to declare experience an illusion, but that move collapses immediately. An illusion is itself an experience. Saying experience is an illusion is like saying sound doesn't exist because it's made of vibrations. The explanation destroys the thing it relies on. Science itself depends on observation, measurement, awareness. If experience is unreal, then the entire scientific enterprise floats on nothing. So that option is gone, which leaves only two honest possibilities. Either experience is something physics has not yet incorporated, or experience is not derivable from physics as currently understood. Neither option is comfortable. The first implies our most successful theory of reality is incomplete in a very deep way. The second implies that reality is not exhausted by physical description at all. Both conclusions disturb the tidy picture we like to keep. What makes this even more unsettling is that physics itself forced this realization. No mysticism is required. No spiritual claims are necessary. You just follow the equations all the way down and you notice what never appears. Experience is not hiding between the lines. It is absent. And that absence matters. Because once you see it, you can no longer pretend that consciousness is just another byproduct of matter, like heat or friction. Heat is explained by motion. Friction is explained by interaction. Consciousness has no such reduction. It does not scale. It does not average. It does not emerge the way temperature emerges. You can pile up descriptions of physical processes forever, and none of them logically require awareness to exist. This is sometimes called the hard problem, but calling it hard understates it. It is not just difficult, it is structurally resistant to the kind of explanation physics offers. And here is the crucial point most people miss. Physics did not fail here. It succeeded exactly as designed. Physics tells us how the world behaves. It does not tell us what the world feels like. We assume those two things would eventually converge. That feeling would fall out of behavior if we analyze deeply enough. There is no evidence that this assumption is true. In fact, all evidence points the other way. The more precisely we describe the universe in physical terms, the more experience drops out of the description. Not because it isn't real, but because it is not the kind of thing physics tracks. And that should make you pause. If the mind were simply located in the brain as a physical object, then experience would be just another physical property. It would be measurable, quantifiable, and expressible in the same language as everything else. But it isn't. which means the problem is not that we haven't looked hard enough. The problem is that we may be looking with the wrong kind of lens. Physics gives us an incredibly accurate map of the external world. But experience is not on the map, even though it is the one thing we know with absolute certainty exists. That tension is not going away. And once you feel it, you can't unfeel it. Because the question is no longer where is the mind, the question becomes far more disturbing. How can something so undeniable be so completely absent from our deepest description of reality? That is not a philosophical puzzle. That is a fault line running straight through our understanding of what the world is made of. 4. Consciousness does not scale with complexity. This is the point where people usually try to escape the problem by appealing to complexity. It feels like a relief. If something is difficult to explain, we say it emerges when systems get complicated enough. More parts, more interactions, more layers eventually, consciousness appears. But that explanation sounds better than it is. Let's be precise, because precision matters. Complexity explains behavior. It explains why systems can do more things, respond in more ways, adapt, learn, calculate, predict. It explains why a simple machine behaves simply and a complicated machine behaves richly. That part is solid. What complexity does not explain is experience. You can increase complexity indefinitely without adding a single drop of awareness. A calculator is more complex than a rock. A computer is more complex than a calculator. A neural network is more complex than a traditional computer program. But complexity alone does not suddenly cause something to feel like anything from the inside. At no point does quantity turn into quality. People talk as if consciousness appears when complexity crosses some invisible threshold, but that is not an explanation. It is a confession that we do not know where the threshold is, how it works, or why it should exist at all. Ask the question plainly: how many interacting parts does it take to produce one unit of experience? No one has an answer, not even a bad one. If consciousness scaled with complexity, we would expect it to behave like other scalable properties. Heat increases as particles move faster, pressure increases as collisions increase. Complexity increases as components and connections increase. But experience does not behave like that. You do not become twice as conscious when you add twice as many neurons. You do not lose half your consciousness when neural activity is reduced by half. Consciousness does not come in clean increments the way physical quantities do. This should trouble you, because physics is built on scaling laws. When something is physical, changes in the system produce predictable changes in the property. Consciousness refuses to cooperate. Consider this carefully. You can remove large portions of the brain, and the person remains conscious, though altered. You can disrupt enormous amounts of neural processing, and awareness persists. But you can also knock someone unconscious instantly with a small change in chemistry or oxygen. The relationship is not linear. It is not smooth. It does not behave the way a physical property should behave if it were simply the output of computation. This is where people quietly shift definitions without admitting it. They stop talking about consciousness and start talking about behavior. They say, the system reports experiences, or the system behaves as if it is aware, or the system has access to internal states. But reporting, behaving, and accessing are not the same as experiencing. A thermometer reports temperature. It does not feel warm. A camera detects light. It does not see. A computer can process symbols representing pain. It does not suffer. Behavior can be explained entirely from the outside. Experience cannot. Complexity gives you better behavior. It gives you more flexible responses. It gives you systems that look intelligent, but looking intelligent is not the same as being aware. This distinction is uncomfortable because it blocks a very convenient escape route. If complexity explained consciousness, then we would already know roughly how it works. We would be arguing about details, not foundations. But instead, we are stuck at the starting line, unable to explain why any physical process should feel like something rather than nothing. and the problem gets worse as systems get more abstract. Modern physics has shown us that the fundamental layers of reality are not solid, intuitive things. They are fields, probabilities, mathematical structures. They do not resemble little machines ticking away inside your head. They are patterns of relation. So now ask yourself, how does piling up patterns create experience? At what point does a pattern stop being just a pattern and start being aware of itself? There is no answer, because awareness is not a pattern in the same sense. You can describe every pattern in the system and still have no description of what it is like to be that system. People often respond by saying consciousness is what the system does when it models itself, but self-modeling is still modeling. It is representation, not realization. A map of a city is not the city. A model of experience is not experience. You can build systems that model themselves endlessly, recursively, with astonishing complexity. That still does not logically require that any of those models be accompanied by awareness. The leap from complexity to consciousness is not small, it is absolute. And physics does not allow absolute leaps without explanation. This is why appeals to emergence fail under scrutiny. They sound scientific, but they do not reduce mystery. They rename it. They move the problem to a higher level and pretend it disappeared. But it didn't. The unsettling implication is this: if consciousness does not scale with complexity, then it is not produced by complexity in the way we assume. That does not mean complexity is irrelevant. It clearly shapes experience. It constrains it. It structures it. But shaping is not generating. A lens shapes light. It does not create light. A filter shapes sound. It does not create sound. Likewise, the brain may shape consciousness without being its source in the way a machine produces output. That idea makes people nervous because it threatens a deeply held intuition that if we just keep adding detail, the mystery will eventually dissolve. Physics does not promise that. Physics promises consistency, not closure. And the honest conclusion here is not mystical or dramatic. It is simply this: complexity explains what systems do, not what they are like to be. And until that gap is closed with something more than hopeful language, the claim that consciousness emerges from complexity remains an assumption, not a discovery. Once you see that, you cannot unsee it. And the comfortable story that the mind is just what very complicated brains do begins to feel much less secure. 5. The mind behaves like a process, not a thing. At this point, if you are still trying to imagine the mind as an object hidden somewhere inside the skull, you are forcing reality to fit a picture it does not want to fit. The evidence has been pushing in a different direction the entire time, not toward a thing, but toward a process. This distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. A thing is stable. It exists whether it is doing anything or not. A rock is still a rock when nothing is happening to it. A chair remains a chair in an empty room. A neuron is still a neuron, even when it is not firing. The mind does not behave this way. Your mind is not continuously present as a fixed entity. It fluctuates. It fades. It disappears entirely under certain conditions. Deep sleep removes it. Anesthesia interrupts it. Certain injuries fragment it. Certain chemicals dissolve it. And then, under the right conditions, it returns. Objects do not behave like that. Processes do. A flame is not a thing you can put in a box. It exists only while certain conditions are met. Fuel, oxygen, temperature, and motion must all align. Remove one element, and the flame does not go somewhere else. It does not hide. It simply ceases to exist as a flame. Nothing has been destroyed. The conditions changed. The mind behaves in exactly this way. When the brain is awake, active, and integrated in the right manner, experience occurs. When those conditions collapse, experience collapses with them. Not because something physical has been removed, but because the process can no longer sustain itself. This alone should force a shift in how the question is framed. If the mind were a thing located in the brain, It would persist even when the system was inactive, the way a heart remains a heart even when it stops beating. But the mind does not persist. It vanishes. And when it returns, it does not come back as the same static object. It resumes as an activity. People often resist this idea because they associate processes with ephemerality, and ephemerality feels threatening. We want the mind to be something solid, something anchored, something that can be pointed to and secured. But physics does not privilege solidity. It privileges accuracy. And accuracy demands that we notice how something behaves, not how we wish it behaved. Consider memory. People talk about memories as if they are stored objects, like files in a cabinet. But no one has ever found a memory sitting intact in the brain. What we find are patterns of connectivity, tendencies of activation, dispositions for reconstruction. When you remember something, you are not retrieving a stored object. You are recreating a process. This is why memories change. This is why they degrade. This is why two recollections of the same event are never identical. That is process behavior, not object behavior. The same is true for identity. People speak as if there is a fixed self residing somewhere inside the mind, observing everything. But the self shifts with mood, context, fatigue, injury, development, and attention. It fractures in dissociation. It multiplies in certain disorders. It dissolves under specific conditions. Objects do not do this. Processes do. Once you accept this, the idea that the mind must be located somewhere starts to look misguided. Processes do not have locations in the way objects do. They are distributed across conditions. They exist in relationships, not in coordinates. A storm does not exist at a single point. It exists across interactions between pressure, temperature, moisture, and motion. You can point to where the storm is happening, but you cannot isolate the storm as a thing separate from those interactions. Likewise, you can point to the brain as the site where mental processes occur, but that does not mean the mind is a thing inside it. It means the brain participates in the conditions that allow the process we call mind to happen. This reframing dissolves several confusions at once. It explains why the mind cannot be found as an object in scans. It explains why damaging the brain alters experience without proving the brain generates experience. It explains why consciousness can disappear and reappear without leaving behind a physical trace. And it explains why asking where the mind is keeps leading to dead ends. Because you do not ask where a process is the way you ask where an object is. You ask under what conditions it occurs. This is the shift most people never make. They keep searching for the mind as if it were a hidden organ, when all evidence points to it being an activity sustained by relationships. They keep demanding a location when the correct question is about structure and dynamics. And once you see the mind this way, something subtle but important happens. The brain stops looking like a container and starts looking like a constraint. It shapes, it channels, it limits, it organizes. But shaping is not the same as originating. A riverbed shapes the river. It does not create the water. This does not mean the mind floats free of the brain or exists independently in some vague way. That would be another leap without justification. What it means is that the brain is part of a larger picture, not the whole story. Processes are real, even though they are not objects. They can be studied, modeled, interrupted, and restored. Physics already works with processes constantly. Fields are processes. Interactions are processes. Time itself in modern physics behaves more like a process than a thing. So it should not surprise us that the mind fits this pattern more naturally than it fits the picture of a localized object. What should surprise us is how long we resisted this conclusion. The resistance does not come from evidence. It comes from habit, from language, from the comfort of imagining ourselves as something solid, sitting somewhere definite in space. But reality has never cared about our comfort. If you follow the evidence honestly, the mind does not look like a thing in the brain. It looks like a process unfolding under specific conditions, shaped by the brain, dependent on the brain, but not identical to it. And once you accept that, the entire question of where the mind is begins to dissolve. Not because the mind is mysterious or magical, but because we were asking the wrong kind of question all along. 6. The observer cannot be removed from reality. This is where the discussion stops being merely uncomfortable and starts becoming destabilizing, because now the problem is no longer just about the mind, it is about reality itself. For a very long time, physics tried to tell a simple story. There is a universe out there doing its thing, completely independent of anyone looking at it. Observers are accidental, minds are late arrivals. The world exists fully formed, and consciousness merely shows up to watch. That story felt clean, it felt objective, and most importantly, it felt safe. Then physics pushed deeper, and the story began to break. At the most fundamental level we can probe, the idea of a completely observer-independent reality starts to wobble, not philosophically, experimentally. The outcomes of measurements depend on how measurements are made. What you choose to observe matters. How you observe it matters. The act of interaction cannot be cleanly separated from what is observed. This is not about human intention or belief. It is not about thinking things into existence. It is about the structure of physical law. When physicists say the observer cannot be removed, they are not smuggling in mysticism. They are acknowledging a fact the equations themselves force on us. The world does not present itself as a finished picture independent of interaction. It presents itself as a set of possibilities that resolve only through interaction. Now pause and notice what just happened. We tried to explain the mind by reducing it to physics, and physics turned around and said, "You don't get to talk about reality without reference to observation." That should give you pause. If observation plays a fundamental role in how physical outcomes are defined, then experience cannot be a late-stage byproduct in the way we assumed. You cannot treat the observer as an optional add-on to reality while also relying on a theory that depends on observation at its core. This does not mean the mind creates reality. That is a misunderstanding people rush into because they are desperate for simple narratives. Reality does not bend to personal wishes. But it does mean that the clean separation between a mindless universe and a passive observer is not supported by our deepest theory. And once that separation breaks, the idea that the mind is just something happening inside the head becomes much harder to defend. If the observer is fundamental to how physical descriptions are completed, then the observer cannot be fully reduced to the thing being observed. You cannot explain observation entirely in terms of objects if observation itself is required to define what those objects are doing. This creates a loop that refuses to close. People often try to escape this by saying the observer is just another physical system interacting with the world. But that move does not solve the problem. It restates it. You are still left with experience itself, which is not captured by any description of the physical interaction. You can describe particles colliding. You can describe detectors firing. You can describe signals being recorded. But none of that tells you what it is like for there to be an observation at all. The description remains external. The experience remains internal. And no amount of external description suddenly turns into the internal point of view. This is why attempts to remove the observer always fail. You can remove people, remove eyes, remove consciousness from your equations, but then you also remove meaning. You remove measurement. You remove the very thing that makes the equations connect to reality. Physics without observation is mathematics floating without anchors. And here is the disturbing implication. If observation is not something you can eliminate from your theory of reality, then the mind is not an afterthought. It is not a decorative feature of complex brains. It is not a side effect that appears once matter gets busy enough. It is woven into the structure of how reality is described. That does not tell us what the mind is, but it tells us something just as important. The mind cannot be treated as a trivial byproduct of matter without creating contradictions elsewhere. The more physics tries to push consciousness aside, the more it finds itself quietly relying on it. This is why the problem refuses to go away. Every attempt to explain the mind purely in terms of physical processes ends up depending on concepts that already assume experience. Measurement, observation, evidence, data, all of these are meaningless without awareness. You cannot build a theory of reality while denying the reality of the thing that allows theories to exist, and this forces a radical shift in perspective. Instead of asking how the mind emerges from a mindless universe, you are forced to consider whether the universe, as described by physics, already presupposes something like mind at a fundamental level. Not personal mind, not human mind, but the fact of experience itself. That idea makes people deeply uncomfortable because it threatens the story of absolute objectivity we have grown attached to. We like to imagine a universe that does not need us, that does not care about being observed, that exists fully without reference to experience. But physics does not give us that universe. It gives us a universe where interaction matters, where observation completes description, where the line between observer and observed is not cleanly drawn. And once that line blurs, the claim that the mind is just a thing inside the brain begins to look not just incomplete, but naive. Not because the brain is unimportant, it is essential, but because the role of the observer cannot be confined to a lump of tissue without breaking the very framework we use to describe reality. This is the point where honest thinking becomes difficult. You are forced to hold two facts at once. The brain matters profoundly, and yet the mind cannot be fully contained within it as a simple physical object. Physics did not set out to challenge our intuitions about consciousness. It simply followed its own logic, and in doing so, it left us with a conclusion we did not ask for but cannot ignore. The observer is not optional, and the mind cannot be dismissed as an afterthought without undermining our understanding of the world itself. 7. The most honest answer is the most unsettling one. By this point, if you've been following carefully and not protecting your assumptions, there is a quiet realization setting in. Not excitement, not revelation, unease. Because the closer we get to an honest answer about the mind, the less satisfying that answer becomes. People expect science to deliver closure, a final statement, a clean explanation that locks everything into place. But that expectation itself is part of the problem. It pushes us to accept premature answers simply because uncertainty feels intolerable. Here is the honest position, stripped of comfort and decoration. We do not know what the mind is. And more importantly, pretending that we do by saying it's just the brain is not scientific confidence. It is intellectual impatience. The brain is necessary. That is beyond dispute. Damage it and experience changes. Shut it down and experience disappears. Restore its function and experience returns. But necessity does not equal identity. Oxygen is necessary for fire. That does not mean oxygen is fire. What we have done, quietly and repeatedly, is mistake dependency for explanation. The phrase, "the mind is in the brain," sounds explanatory, but it actually explains nothing. It does not tell you how experience arises. It does not tell you why awareness exists at all. It does not tell you why electrical activity should feel like something rather than nothing. It merely reassures you that the problem has been put somewhere familiar. And familiarity is not truth. The disturbing part is not that the mind is mysterious. Mystery is expected at the edges of knowledge. The disturbing part is that our most basic assumptions about ourselves were never earned. They were inherited. We absorbed them from diagrams, textbooks, and simplified narratives long before we were capable of questioning them. Once those assumptions are removed, the ground feels unstable. If the mind is not a thing with a location, then asking where it is becomes meaningless. If it is not a product of complexity, then adding more detail does not solve the problem. If physics cannot describe experience, then physical description is not the whole story. If the observer cannot be removed, then consciousness is not a trivial add-on. None of this tells you what the mind is. but it tells you what it is not. It is not a lump of matter hiding behind your forehead. It is not a measurable object waiting to be detected. It is not an illusion that can be dismissed without destroying science itself. And it is not a simple output of computation in the way we like to imagine. What remains is unsettling because it resists containment. The mind may be more like a pattern than a thing, more like an activity than an object, more like a relationship than a location. It may exist the way meaning exists, or the way information exists, or the way laws of nature exist, not as objects in space, but as structures that shape what happens. That idea makes people uncomfortable because it refuses to sit neatly inside the physical boxes we rely on to understand everything else. And here is the final point that most people miss. Admitting ignorance here is not a failure of science. It is a success of honesty. Science advances not by declaring victory, but by identifying where its explanations break down. The breakdown around consciousness is not a flaw to be hidden, it is a signal, a signpost pointing toward a deeper revision of how we think about reality and ourselves. Every major advance in physics came from taking something that seemed obvious and discovering that it was wrong. Absolute space, absolute time, solid matter, determinism, each felt undeniable until it wasn't. The belief that the mind is simply located in the brain may belong in that same category. That does not mean the mind is mystical, supernatural, or beyond investigation. It means our current framework is inadequate, and clinging to it out of fear only delays understanding. The most honest answer, then, is not a solution. It is a stance. We do not yet know what kind of thing the mind is. We do not yet know how experience fits into the structure of reality. And any explanation that claims to have closed the case is almost certainly hiding unanswered questions behind confident language. That realization is disturbing because it removes certainty where we want it most about ourselves. But it is also liberating, because once you stop pretending the mystery is solved, you are finally free to investigate it seriously. And that, more than any comforting answer, is where real understanding begins. If you are hoping for a neat conclusion, a sentence that ties everything up and hands you certainty, you're going to be disappointed. And that disappointment is the point. The most dangerous idea in science is not ignorance. It is false clarity. It is the moment we decide a question is settled simply because we are tired of sitting with it. The mind is the one thing you never doubt exists. You can doubt the world. You can doubt your senses. You can doubt every theory ever written. But you cannot doubt that you are experiencing something right now. And yet, that most certain fact about reality refuses to fit inside our most powerful physical descriptions. That should humble you. Not because science is weak, but because reality is deeper than our current explanations. The brain matters. The body matters. Physics matters. But none of them, on their own, explain why there is something it is like to be you. So if there is one conclusion worth keeping, it is not an answer. It is a discipline. Do not confuse description with explanation. Do not mistake correlation for cause. Do not force reality to obey your intuitions just because they feel comfortable. The moment you stop insisting that the mind must be a thing in a place, you stop asking the wrong questions, and only then do better questions become possible. That is not the end of the investigation. That is where it actually begins.